meditation. We talked last time about the mind being better known than the body. We'd also talked about some of the ramifications of Descartes' argument for the existence of God and how Descartes dealt with the problem of evil. That was not discussed in the text, but it was certainly a fair question, and I was glad to answer it. Now, in his fifth meditation, which I didn't mention, he spends most of that summing up what he had concluded in meditations 1 through 4. Before moving on to the sixth meditation, which will largely deal with this concern about the mind and the body. Now, was made clear to us already that Descartes conceives of the mind and the body as two separate and distinct substances. Now, folks, it seems peculiar to talk about the mind as a substance. And this is obviously because why? Yeah, Mr. Schmidt.
Referring to the mind as more of a consciousness?
Yeah, the mind doesn't seem to be what we typically call a substance. When we call something substantial, we expect something that's tactile, that we can hear, smell, see, taste, etc. In other words, a physical thing discernible by the senses. The thing is, Descartes argues that the mind is actually better known than the body. It is a separate and distinct substance. The body, and I want you to know this word. If you read Descartes in his own, in translation, you will see the body described as corporeal, from the Latin word corpus. It refers to, bodily stuff, physical stuff. The mind is a peculiar form of substance. It is incorporeal. Part of Descartes' rationale for why they are separate and distinct substances is because they have very different... Mind and body have very different properties from one another. One is immaterial, the other is material. The body we typically refer to as a public thing, whereas the mind is what? Private. When I say that the body is public, I'm saying that other people can observe it with their senses. Only who can know one's own mind? Yeah, only you, oneself, can know one's mind. Your mind is your inner space, if you will. The mind is non-spatial. The body is a spatial thing. And not to be too cliche here, but if you ask the question, where is my mind? Most people would point where? They would point to their head, but keep this in mind. The mind and the brain are not one and the same thing, according to Descartes. The body is more like a biological machine. And Descartes understood that as a biological machine, it is subject to what? The laws of biology, physics, and chemistry, just like anything else in the mechanical material world. Whereas the mind is not like a machine. As a matter of fact, the mind is in one sense this. Give me 30 seconds. The mind is in one sense a simple thing because it's not made up of what? Yeah, it's not made up of parts. But nonetheless, it is absolutely real. And to hold that one more, he refers to his mind. He says, my mind, my soul, and myself. And the reason I wanted to bring that up, not just because that's a famous line from Descartes, but because Descartes defines the true self not as the body, but as the mind. And he explains that the mind is actually the controller of the body, even though the two things need what? As far as we know, they need one another to operate. 30 more seconds. The position Descartes is going to take Descartes is going to take a position called dualism, also known as dualistic interaction, also known as dualistic interactionism. All of them refer to the fact that Descartes contends that this thing we call the self consists of both mind and body. He recognizes that it is a problem because it is not self-evident how a non-physical thing could interact with a physical thing. It is not self-evident how a physical thing could interact with an immaterial thing, and vice versa. Mr. Peters.
How did Descartes discuss reflections of the mind on the body? So for example, like when I'm having a fairly stormy mental day, I'll probably bite my inner lip quite a bit. Like that's something that's not intentional, but someone else could observe it as a cue of what my mind is doing.
Oh, well, I'm not sure exactly what the question is, but I'll speak as best I can to it.
I apologize.
Yeah.
For the vague one.
Yeah, Descartes would contend that your true self is in fact your mental self. Your body is more like the vehicle that your mind, soul, resides in. And indeed, we might actually come to think of the self as being more like our body than our mind. And indeed, we need our what, it seems? It seems we need the body, and sometimes our interaction with the body is, I guess, part of what we need to actually feel real, if you will. He talks about, sometimes I just want to bite my lip, you know, to tell myself something about my inner state. And indeed, I cannot observe Mr. Peters' inner space. However, I can get cues about his inner space through my experiences and seeing how he's behaving. Obviously, if somebody's asleep in the seat, I would say, oh, that person is what? I'll use the cliche, checked out or whatever. I'd say that person is checked out. Because I infer, because of the operations of my mind, that when I have zoned out, that my state of consciousness is very different than if I were attentive and paying attention. Now, I suppose, and this is inductive, I suppose that your inner life is probably not all that different from my inner life. Even though I can't what? Even though I can't prove it, even though I can't know it. And the main reason is because I infer from our outer similarities and the fact that we are all human beings, that each of us must have at least a similar kind of inner life. Now, what can I technically prove? I can't prove that you're not cyborgs. And you can't know that I'm not a cyborg either. And by the way, it might not be plausible that I'm a cyborg, but it's certainly what? Yeah, it is certainly possible that I could be a cyborg. Now, you infer that I'm not a cyborg, but guess what I could imagine? I could imagine an extremely complex cyborg being produced in the future. And I don't want to belabor this point here. But you do know that artificial intelligence can functionally exhibit a lot of the same characteristics as these things that we call minds. But the reason that we infer that only things like us can have minds is because we associate the mind with this thing called, let me write it on the board, Because we associate the mind with this peculiar thing that we call consciousness. Now, admittedly, the textbook doesn't play around with this concept as much as it could. It's an extremely fascinating subject. And there's actually a whole sector of philosophy devoted to talking about this kind of stuff. And unsurprisingly, guess what it's called? Yeah. Unsurprisingly, we call it philosophy of mind. Some of the concerns of this philosophy of mind stuff come straight out of some of the concerns generated out of Cartesian philosophy. Now, you might note, folks, with me and Descartes, that to some extent, having a mind seems to be dependent upon our having a what? Yeah, a biological structure. Now, Descartes contended that it may be possible, even though we can't prove it, for the mind, soul, and the body to exist independently after what? Yeah, after we die. Now, unsurprisingly, this was perfectly consistent with his what? Yeah, his religion. If you didn't already believe Descartes' religion, that conjecture would probably seem what? It would probably seem implausible and perhaps even absurd. Because one might actually ask this question. If indeed the mind is dependent upon what? If the mind is indeed dependent upon the brain, then why not take the position of this other philosopher? Then why not take the position of Thomas Hobbes, who rejected a dualistic model? He's not saying that we're not conscious. But Hobbes took this position. Hobbes was a materialist. The materialist contends that there is only one reality, and it's physical reality. This thing that you call the mind is not a separate and distinct substance, even though it might seem to be one. Because in fact, if it were not for your having a neurological system, how could you have this thing called consciousness? So consciousness must be secondary. Now, Descartes' position will say that the mind and the body are two separate and distinct substances. And how do they interact with one another? He hypothesizes that there is this gland in the brain. And by the way, this pineal gland, how many of you read about this? Descartes hypothesized that the pineal gland in the brain is somehow neither mind nor body, and also somehow both exhibits mind and body characteristics. And thus, it is the communication hub between the mind and the body. He says there must be some kind of connection portal between the two. Now, I will admit that nobody is very convinced of Descartes' solution to the mind-body problem. Anyone guess why? This doesn't mean that they reject dualism. It's just that they reject his solution to the mind-body problem. As a matter of fact, I would contend that most of you probably have some dualistic points of view, and you likely speak the language of dualism. You know what I mean by when I say you speak the language of dualism? When you speak of yourself, you are oftentimes merely speaking of your what? Of your mind. And you probably also speak of your mind and your body as sometimes what? Somehow different from one another, even if they are what? Somehow mutually dependent upon one another. If we were to punch you in the face, not that I'm suggesting we should, where would the pain be? Hint, not in your face. Pain is not a physical event, even if it's what? Even if it is a function of physical events. Pain is something that happens where? Yeah, pain is a mental event. Just like the color blue is not out there in the world. Blue is a feature of our mental life. Just like sounds aren't out there in the world. Sounds occur in our inner space. Even though we would have to admit that our ability to experience sounds is a function of things like trees falling and so forth. But to see a color, color is a mental event. Sounds are mental events. Pain is a mental event, even if they are somehow dependent upon physical reality. Now the question is, how are we able to get these things in our mind, given that physical reality is one reality and mental reality seems to be what? As Descartes would put it, a completely separate and distinct substance. He says they interact through this thing called the pineal gland. But why does that solve nothing? Hint, if you can touch it, see it, smell it, whatever, then it must be physical, not mental. In other words, if we can pry open your skull and poke your pineal gland, it's physical. So his contending that some physical thing is the connection portal really doesn't solve anything. In other words, we're still left with the mystery of how can the two things interact. Now, of course, the physicalist might make the claim that there's really only one substance, and the text doesn't go into this detail, but the only substance is material reality. And this thing that we call consciousness is sometimes referred to as an emergent property of brains. Now, why do you think that both you and René Descartes, maybe not you, but many of you people in René Descartes could not take that position seriously? And this is the problem with materialism. If materialism is true, then your mind is really not a separate and distinct substance. If you can't, yeah, Mr. Toberman.
Doesn't it, like, get rid of the idea of an afterlife?
Yeah, it would seem to undermine just not just this idea of a soul, but it would also undermine the idea of an afterlife. So many people have difficulty taking the materialist position seriously. And here's another reason. This thing that we call consciousness does seem to be mysteriously different from my physical states. So even if it is somehow a function of electrochemical activity in my brain, it still seems to be somehow different. Simply because we can talk about my seeing a patch of blue in terms of wavelengths, there is still something distinct about what it is like to experience the color blue, or the smell of wildflowers, or whatever example you want to give me. Yeah?
How are modern philosophers discussing our ability to see the brain reacting in real time via like MRI and so forth? Like, wouldn't that give credence to the brain just being an electrochemical structure instead of a separate entity?
Yeah. And granted, there's a lot that's been done on this. And most of the accounts that Mr. Peters is referring to would be referred to as physicalist accounts of one sort. You don't have to know this for the test, but since you mention it, one version of this is called the central state identity theory. Now, admittedly, the label sounds kind of fancy Dan. But what this really means is simply something like this. That every time you're having some kind of a thought, or an experience of, the color blue or the smell of wildflowers or whatever, it corresponds with a what? Your mental states will always correspond with neurological states in the brain. Even though it is not so easy to, what shall I say, concretely map that every time you have this brain state you will be experiencing a patch of blue, it doesn't quite work that way. But it does suggest that there is always some kind of a relationship between brain states and what we call our mental states. And it would seem to suggest what about our so-called mental states? It would seem to suggest dependency of our mental states upon and I don't want to be too vulgar about this, but this scares the crap out of some people. Because as Mr. Tobinman was saying, once you start to talk about the mind as dependent upon the brain, you're starting to run down this slippery slope where you might next say, well, why should we even really be talking about the mind as a separate and distinct thing? And along with that, the mind-soul seems a less tenable concept. And by the way, pretty soon, you might even ask, why not just explain everything? Let me put a word on the board. This is not in the textbook. Why not a reductive explanation? How many of you have heard of reductive explanations, or what is sometimes called reductionism? We call it reductionism because what we do is we take what appears to be a difficult to explain phenomenon, and we explain it in terms that are this, that are simpler, and almost always the simpler explanations will also be this. Not always, but in this case, also quantifiable. Now you'll notice whenever I talk about the experience of seeing the color blue, or the experience of listening to Beethoven's Pastoral Sixth, I would be talking about my mental events. A reductive explanation of my mental events would talk about what Mr. Peters was talking about. We might sit me down, make me listen to Beethoven's Sixth, and then record what?
Brain.
Yeah, record my brain states. And then we would say his experience of Beethoven's Pastoral Sixth is just these electrical impulses that we have just recorded. And I don't want to get all science fiction on you, but suppose we did produce a device like right out of, how many of you have seen the film Until the End of the World? Oh, I guess I'm showing my age here. It's a film by Wim Wenders. Good soundtrack, by the way, which might also be showing my taste a little bit. But it was a long film and there was a buttload of stuff going on. But one of the odd science fiction things going on was one of the main characters was developing this device that could record thoughts, dreams, and things of this nature, and then you could do what? You could basically plug someone else into it. So you could give that other person, who might be blind, for example, the mental experience of actually doing what? Seeing. Because seeing is a very strange phenomenon. because there is something that it is like to see something. That you can explain in terms of wavelengths. You can explain it in terms of electrical events happening in the brain. But there is something clear and distinct about our experience of the world through our sight, sound, whatever, which we might be able to explain in quantitative electrochemical terms. But the critic would still say, you can explain something reductively, but it still doesn't seem to cut it. Because the color blue is not just whatever the wavelengths that it corresponds to. Because there is something that it is like to see the color blue. And that event happens where? Oh, that's a no-brainer. It happens in minds. Experience happens in minds. Without a mind, you could experience what? Nothing. This is why someone like Descartes would say you cannot reduce the mind and explain it in terms of neurochemicals. Well, you could explain it in terms of neurochemicals, but it certainly wouldn't do justice to this phenomenon that we call experience. Now, simply because we can't explain how the mind and body interact, obviously they what? According to Descartes. Obviously they do interact. Otherwise, I couldn't take in the whole room in my consciousness.
So would Descartes argue that the brain is just a worldly conductor for the mind, basically?
Yeah, it is part of our physical apparatus. But the true you is the mental you. Although it's still difficult to conceive of the mental me being the true me, given that the mental me is purely dependent upon what, as far as I can tell?
Physical you.
Yeah, physical brain activity. And this is the mystery of consciousness. And by the way, there are people still working on this problem, trying to figure out how it is that complex neurological systems are able to be this thing that we call conscious. And I don't want to go too much off on a tangent here, because this is not mentioned in the book. But there are some psychologists who are even questioning what we mean when we say that we are conscious. Because most of our quote-unquote decisions and so forth, even if we think we're making them via conscious processes, you've probably heard this before. We've almost always made our decision before we've actually been made conscious of the decision. So that begs the question, is it my mental states that are doing the deciding, or is it a purely chemical phenomenon? This is supposed to get kind of scary. Oh, Mr. Toberman, talk to me. You had a question or comment?
Yeah. So, like, is our mind kind of like possessing our body in like what Descartes is saying?
Well, he might not like to put it that way, but he uses this analogy. He says it is a little bit like a captain and his ship, except the relationship is closer. Because you'll notice the captain can do what? The captain can get off at port and buy some rum or whatever, correct? In other words, the captain and the ship are not inextricably linked. Someone else could captain the ship and so forth. However, as far as we know, your mind and your body in this conscious life that we're living are inseparable from one another. Unless you're my aunt who believes in astral projection. Oh good, I got a couple of grins there. You know, she believes she can get into a trance and she can soul travel. That's what she calls it. Oh, and yeah, I'll make fun of her for a minute. She is part of a smorgasbord New Age religion that sort of takes little bits and pieces of a whole lot of different religions. But yeah, she believes that